Setting up AWS Load Balancer Controller in EKS, a comprehensive step-by-step guide. This podcast is brought to you by Business Compass LLC. We are an Amazon Web Services advanced consulting partner. We build and migrate workloads to Amazon Cloud. Our website is businesscompassllc.com. Our phone number is 973-638-2228. Our email address is contact@businesscompassllc.us. Introduction to Ingress Controllers and OIDAK and EKS. Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service, EKS, offers a robust platform for deploying, managing, and scaling containerized applications. One of the essential components of managing traffic in a Kubernetes environment is the Ingress Controller. The AWS Load Balancer Controller, designed explicitly for EKS, automates your cluster's Elastic Load Balancers, ELBs, management. This podcast will walk you through setting up the AWS Load Balancer Controller, from prerequisites to final installation, ensuring a secure and efficient deployment. Prerequisites: EKS cluster and kubectl. Before diving into the setup, ensure that you have the following prerequisites in place. EKS cluster: you should have a running EKS cluster. If you haven't set one up yet, you can follow the official AWS EKS documentation. Kubectl: install the Kubernetes command line tool kubectl and ensure it's configured to interact with your EKS cluster. Configuring OIDAC for secure authentication. OpenID Connect, OIDC, provides secure authentication for your EKS cluster. AWS integrates OIDAC with IAM roles, allowing your Kubernetes workloads to assume roles securely without AWS credentials. To configure OIDAC for your EKS cluster, associate OIDAC with your EKS cluster. Use the AWS CLI to associate an OIDC provider with your EKS cluster. Extl utils associate EAM OIDP provider region cluster _name approve. Verify OIDAC association. Confirm the OIDAT provider association using the AWS Management Console or CLI. Deploying the AWS Load Balancer Controller. 4.1 Creating an IAM policy for ELB controller permissions. The AWS Load Balancer Controller requires specific permissions to create and manage AWS resources. Follow these steps to create an IAM policy. Create the IAM policy. Save the following policy document as eampolicy.json. Version: October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect: allow. Action: EC2: describe subnets. EC2: describe security groups. EC2: describe VPCs. EC2: describe instances. Elastic load balancing. EAM create service linked role. EAM get server certificate. EAM list server certificates. Resource. Create the IAM policy using the AWS CLI. AWS EAM create policy name OS Load Balancer Controller EAM policy document file //eam policy.json. 4.2 Creating an IAM role and Kubernetes service account. To enable the Load Balancer Controller to assume the necessary IAM roles, you must create a service account linked to an IAM role. Create an IAM role. Use Extl to create the role and associate it with your Kubernetes service account. Extl create IAM service account. Cluster _name. Namespace Cube System. Name AWS Load Balancer Controller. Attach policy arn AWS EAM account _id policy /os Load Balancer Controller EAM policy. Approve. Verify role creation. Check the IAM role in the AWS Management Console to ensure it's correctly attached to the service account. Installing the Ingress Controller using Helm. Helm is the preferred way to install the AWS Load Balancer Controller on your EKS cluster. Follow these steps to install it. Add the EKS Helm chart repository. Add the AWS EKS Helm chart repository. Helm repo add xhttps://aws.github.io/xcharts. Helm repo update. Install the AWS Load Balancer Controller. Install the controller using Helm. Helm install AWS Load Balancer Controller x/AWS Load Balancer Controller. Set cluster name equals cluster _name. Set service account.create equals false. Set service account.name equals AWS Load Balancer Controller. Namespace Cube System. Optional, verifying the installation. To ensure that the AWS Load Balancer Controller is correctly installed and functioning. Check the deployment status. Verify the deployment using kubectl. kubectl get deployment n-kube system AWS load balancer controller. Test the ingress controller. Deploy and expose a sample application using an ingress resource to test the functionality conclusion. Setting up the AWS load balancer controller in an EKS cluster is essential for managing traffic efficiently and securely. Following this podcast, you've configured OIDA key, created necessary IAM roles, and installed the load balancer controller using Helm. With everything set up, your EKS cluster is ready to handle traffic using AWS managed load balancers. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please share this podcast, visit our website and follow our social media links.